The Focke-Wulf sat in the mud with its belly pan scraped raw and its propeller bent back like a wilted flower. Somewhere in France, late 1944, American ground crews walked circles around it, poking at the annular cowling, running fingers along the BMW 801 radial's exhaust stubs. A pristine German fighter, more or less intact, sitting on an Allied airstrip with no bullet holes, no flak damage, no sign it had been shot down at all. And standing next to it, still in his flight suit, First Lieutenant Bruce Carr of the 354th Fighter Group couldn't stop grinning. Nobody on that field had seen anything like it. Carr had taken off that morning in a P-38 Lightning. He came back in a Focke-Wulf 190. Now look, this story sounds like barracks fiction. A lone American pilot lands on a functioning Luftwaffe airfield, fuels up a German fighter, and flies it home. If that sounds too insane to be real, it probably means you're paying attention. Hit subscribe if you want the kind of history that doesn't soften the edges. Drop a like if you think stories like this deserve more than a footnote. And if you know a detail I miss, comments exist for a reason. The whole thing gets stranger. Carr didn't plan any of it. He didn't volunteer for some commando raid. He didn't sneak behind the lines with forged papers and a silenced pistol. The sequence of events that put him in that cockpit started with something much simpler and much worse, getting shot down. Days earlier, Carr's Lightning took hits during a strafing run over Germany. The details of exactly where he went down stay murky. Carr told the story multiple times across decades, and the geography shifts between tellings. What stays consistent? He belly landed in German-held territory, crawled out, and found himself alone in winter with no radio, no sidearm worth mentioning, and the Wehrmacht between him and friendly lines. Most evaders in that situation linked up with resistance networks. Carr did something different. He moved toward a German airfield he'd spotted from the air on the way down. Stop and think about that. An unarmed American pilot, on foot, in enemy territory, chose to walk toward the place with the most German soldiers per square yard in the entire region, not away from the enemy, toward the densest concentration of enemy personnel he could find. The logic, if you can call it that, ran something like this. Airfields have airplanes, airplanes fly, and Bruce Carr intended to fly home. The man grew up in Ponca City, Oklahoma, had been flying since his teens, and apparently viewed a Luftwaffe base the way a car thief views a parking lot. He spent days working his way close. Cold, hungry, sleeping in ditches and hedgerows. The accounts agree on the physical misery. Carr lost weight he didn't have to lose, scrounged what food he could, kept moving at night. When he reached the airfield perimeter, he watched, counted guards, tracked patrol patterns, noted which aircraft sat fueled and which sat empty. The Focke-Wulf 190A model, and sources conflict on whether it sat at dispersal or near a maintenance hangar, caught his eye. Single-seat radial engine, wide landing gear that forgave sloppy ground handling. Carr knew the type from recognition training and from trying to kill them in the air. He'd never sat in one, never read a German instrument panel, never touched the throttle quadrant, which operated in reverse compared to American fighters, forward for idle, back for power, a detail that, handled wrong at the worst moment, turns a stolen airplane into a fireball at the end of a runway. To understand how a man with no tools, no working knowledge of German engineering, and no reason to expect any of it would work, pulled this off, and what the Luftwaffe ground crews did when they realized what had happened, we have to walk through the theft itself, step by step, because the sheer mechanical audacity of it, the gap between what Carr knew and what he needed to know, tells you something about the kind of pilot the American training pipeline produced in 1944. The Germans built a superb fighter in the Focke-Wulf 190, fast, rugged, a killer at medium altitude, and an American lieutenant who'd never seen the inside of one stole it off their own tarmac before breakfast. Bruce Carr called it the most fun I ever had in an airplane. Given what he did for a living, that's saying something. Oberleutnant Armin Faber rolled his Focke-Wulf 190A3 into a victory turn over the Bristol Channel on the 23rd of June 1942 and pointed his nose north. He'd just tangled with Spitfires over Exeter, claimed a kill, felt the adrenaline, And now he needed to get home. The channel glittered below him. France lay south. Faber flew north. He had confused the Bristol Channel for the English Channel, rotated his mental map 180 degrees, and aimed himself deeper into Wales instead of back toward Brittany. Every mile he flew took him farther from safety. He didn't know it. This matters because the Focke-Wulf 190 had been eating the RAF alive for nearly a year. Since its operational debut in the summer of 1941, the radial-nosed fighter had outclassed every mark of Spitfire then in service below 20,000 feet, faster in level flight. Better roll rate, dramatically better, almost twice the Spitfire 5's rate at certain speeds. The British knew it existed. They'd watched it kill their pilots over the Channel coast in numbers that made fighter command sweat. What they didn't have, and desperately needed, amounted to a working example they could tear apart, measure, fly, and design against. Technical intelligence without a specimen stays theoretical. You can count rivets in gun camera footage all day long. Until you put the actual machine on a test stand, you're guessing. Faber gave them the machine. He spotted an airfield below, mistook it for a Luftwaffe base in France, lowered his gear, and set down at RAF Pembrey in South Wales. A clean landing, no damage. The ground crew at Pembrey couldn't believe what they watched taxi toward them. A pristine frontline German fighter rolling to a stop on British concrete, canopy sliding back, a confused pilot climbing out and looking around at faces that spoke no German and wore the wrong uniforms. The duty officer reportedly jumped onto the wing and grabbed Faber's pistol before the Oberleutnant fully understood what had happened. Within hours, RAF intelligence had the airplane under guard and under tarps. Within days, it sat at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where British engineers pulled inspection panels, ran the BMW 801 up on a test stand, and started cataloging every advantage the design held over their own fighters. The results confirmed the worst. The 190 outperformed the Spitfire 5 in almost every measurable category below medium altitude. Roll rate, climb below 15,000 feet, acceleration in a dive, sustained turn performance. The Commandogerät, the automated engine management system that handled prop pitch, fuel mixture, and boost pressure through a single throttle lever, struck the British engineers as borderline science fiction. RAF pilots had to manage those systems by hand. The German pilot shoved one lever, and the Commandogerät handled the rest. A captured Luftwaffe technical manual described the system's purpose as ensuring the pilot fights, not the engine. Their words. The philosophy embedded in that sentence explains half of what made the airplane dangerous. The British flew it against everything they had. Typhoons, Spitfire 9s, captured Messerschmitt 109s. Every test flight generated data that fed directly into tactical countermeasures and new aircraft requirements. Faber's navigational blunder, one confused pilot over one channel, handed the Allies a technical windfall worth more than a squadron of reconnaissance flights. Now here's where the absurdity scales. Faber didn't mean to land at Pembrey. The man made a mistake. A spectacularly useful mistake from the Allied perspective, but a mistake all the same. A combat-rattled pilot who got turned around and landed at the wrong field. None of it was deliberate, just a gift dropped into British laps by a disoriented Oberleutnant who thought Wales looked enough like Brittany to put his wheels down. Bruce Carr's situation inverted every element of that story. Carr didn't get confused. He didn't stumble onto the wrong airfield. He identified a German base on purpose, approached it on foot over multiple days through hostile territory, surveilled its defenses, selected a specific aircraft, and then, starving, unarmed, operating on the mechanical intuition of a 20-year-old from Oklahoma, climbed into a cockpit labeled entirely in German and took off. Faber gave the British a Focke-Wulf by accident. Carr took one from the Luftwaffe by will. So what did he actually do when he reached that flight line? The sequence matters, because every step in it could have killed him. How bad did it actually get for the RAF before Faber's gift landed at Pembrey? Bad enough that Fighter Command stopped publishing comparative performance charts for the Spitfire 5 against the 190. The numbers embarrassed them. At 10,000 feet, the altitude where most channel engagements happened, the Focke-Wulf held a 25 to 30 mile/hour speed advantage in level flight. It rolled into a bank faster than any Allied fighter in the European theater. It could push over into a dive and simply leave a Spitfire behind. The BMW 14-cylinder radial pulling cleanly through negative G maneuvers that starved the Merlin's float carburetor and cut its power at exactly the wrong moment. British pilots developed a grim shorthand for the tactical situation over northern France in the spring of 1942. You could fight, or you could run, but you couldn't do both, because the 190 decided which option you got. The Luftwaffe knew what they had. Jagdgeschwader 26, the unit that introduced the type operationally over the Channel, racked up kill ratios that hadn't been seen since the Battle of Britain, except now the Germans held the advantage. Oberstleutnant Adolf Galland, already an ace many times over, flew the 190 early and reportedly told Göring it handled like the fighter he'd been asking for since 1940. Galland wanted the type everywhere. Production couldn't keep up with demand. Focke-Wulf's Bremen factory pushed airframes out as fast as the jigs allowed, and still the frontline units screamed for more. The airplane represented the first time since the Messerschmitt 109's debut that the Luftwaffe held a clear qualitative edge in a single-engine fighter over every opponent simultaneously. RAF, Soviet Air Force, nobody had an answer below 20,000 feet. Then Faber handed them one on a silver platter, and the Luftwaffe's reaction tells you everything about how seriously they valued the secret. The records from the German side on this point stay thin. No surviving Luftwaffe memo specifically addresses the Faber incident in the files available to researchers, but the operational response speaks for itself. Within weeks of the capture, German units along the Channel coast received revised standing orders on emergency landing procedures, fuel state minimums for return flights, and navigation protocols after combat. Somebody high up understood that a single intact specimen in British hands could unravel months of tactical advantage. They couldn't get the airplane back. All they could do was try to make sure it never happened again. At Farnborough, the captured 190, given the RAF serial number MP469, went through the most thorough evaluation the Royal Aircraft Establishment had conducted on any enemy type to that point. Look at the test reports. The engineers didn't just fly it, they lived with it. They ran the BMW 801 for hours on the test stand, measuring exhaust gas temperatures, oil pressure curves, fuel consumption at every throttle setting. The smell of hot castrol and avgas hung over that corner of the facility for weeks. Pilots who flew MP469 described the vibration through the stick as distinctive, a low-frequency hum from the radial that pulsed through the airframe at cruise power, completely unlike the smoother inline vibration of a Merlin. The rudder pedals transmitted every bump on the grass taxi strips at Farnborough with a directness that surprised men used to the Spitfire's slightly mushier ground handling. One test pilot noted the cockpit ran hot, radial engine heat soaking back through the firewall into a greenhouse canopy with mediocre ventilation. In summer, the German pilots who flew it operationally must have cooked. The vulnerability data mattered more than the performance data. The 190's weak spots emerged clearly under controlled testing. Above 25,000 feet, the BMW radial lost power faster than the supercharged Merlin. The airplane grew sluggish, heavy on the controls. A different machine than the knife fighter, it became down low. The test pilots found the elevator forces increased dramatically at high speed. Above 400 miles per hour indicated, pulling out of a dive took real muscle, and the control harmony that made the airplane so pleasant at medium speeds disappeared. The fuel system had quirks. The commandogerät, brilliant as it performed in normal flight, introduced lag during rapid throttle changes that a skilled opponent could exploit in a scissors fight. Every one of those findings went directly into tactical bulletins distributed to frontline RAF squadrons. For the first time, Spitfire pilots had a specific playbook: drag the fight above 20,000 feet, force the 190 into sustained turning contests where its wing loading worked against it, exploit the commandogerät lag with rapid throttle reversals, and never follow one into a dive below 10,000 feet. The data from one captured airplane reshaped air combat doctrine over the entire Channel front. Over western Czechoslovakia, November 1944, the ground looked like a quilt someone had set on fire. Burned-out rail yards trailed smoke into a gray sky. Craters pocked the roads in clusters where previous flights had already worked them over. And down in the middle of it, at treetop height, the P-51 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group came screaming through at 300 miles per hour, with their guns hot and their pilots scanning for anything that moved on rails or rubber. Bruce Carr flew in this, every day. The missions blurred together after a while. Truck columns, locomotive hunts, airfield suppression runs, where the flak came up so thick the tracers looked like orange rain falling upward. The 354th had earned the nickname Pioneer Mustang Group because they'd been the first fighter unit in the entire 9th Air Force to receive the P-51B model back in late 1943. By the time the war ground into its final winter, the group had transitioned through B models, C models, and finally the D model Mustang with the bubble canopy and the Packard-built Merlin that could hold 67 inches of manifold pressure in war emergency. Carr flew them all. His aerial record by November 44 stood at 15 confirmed victories. Respectable, more than respectable, ace 3 times over, in a theater where Luftwaffe fighters grew scarcer by the month, and most American pilots finished their tours without ever firing at another airplane in anger. Carr found them. He had a predator's eye for the geometry of an intercept, a knack for spotting the glint of a canopy against cloud cover before anyone else in the formation called it. 14 of those 15 kills came in the Mustang. The 15th, well, that one gets complicated, and the paperwork around it suggests the intelligence officers who processed the claim didn't quite know what box to check. But the kills only told part of it. By late 44, the real work of American fighter groups in Europe had shifted from air-to-air combat to something far more dangerous: armed reconnaissance at low altitude over a continent bristling with light flak. The Wehrmacht had flooded its supply routes with 20mm and 37mm automatic weapons, towed behind half-tracks and bolted onto railcar flatbeds. The gunners didn't need radar. They didn't need predictor sights. At 200 feet, a Mustang filled the sky, and all a flak crew had to do amounted to pointing the barrel at the noise and holding the trigger. The smell inside a Mustang cockpit during a low-level strafing pass defied easy description. Cordite from the .650 caliber Brownings leaked back through the gun bay into the cockpit on every trigger pull. Engine oil heated to operating temperature gave off a sweet mechanical tang that mixed with the leather of the seat harness and the metallic bite of pure oxygen from the regulator. Sweat pooled under the parachute straps. And underneath all of it, the airframe vibrated with a frequency that changed depending on speed. A smooth hum at cruise, a shuddering rattle during a firing pass when 6 guns recoiled simultaneously and the whole nose kicked. Carr's 354th operated from forward airstrips that moved with the front, dirt fields mostly, pierced steel planking laid over mud. The ground crews worked in the open through a European winter that dropped temperatures below freezing for weeks at a stretch, fingers cracking and bleeding as they loaded belts of armor-piercing incendiary into ammunition bays by flashlight before dawn. The pilots ate K rations, slept in tents, flew 2 or 3 sorties a day when weather allowed. Casualties in the low-level attack role ran higher than in any other fighter mission type. The 8th Air Force's bomber escort groups got the headlines. The 9th's fighter-bomber groups got the flak. Carr absorbed punishment the way some pilots simply do, not through luck alone, but through an aggression so constant it bent probability. Pressing attacks closer than doctrine recommended was just the start. He made second passes on targets that had already opened fire, which experienced pilots understood as the fastest way to die in a Mustang. The flak gunners adjusted after the first pass. They knew your altitude and your heading, knew your speed from the sound alone. Coming back around handed them a solution on a platter. On the mission where his luck finally cracked, Carr's lightning, he'd been temporarily flying the P-38 on a specific tasking, the records don't clarify why, took hits that no amount of aggression could overcome. The sequence that followed put him on the ground in German territory with nothing but his flight suit and an idea that no sane person would have entertained. What does it feel like when a Mustang stops flying? Carr described the moment in pieces. The flak caught him during a strafing run, 20 millimeter probably, based on the damage pattern, and the Merlin's coolant temperature spiked immediately. Glycol streamed back over the canopy in a white vapor trail that told every gunner on the ground exactly where he headed. A Packard V1650 with a punctured coolant jacket had maybe 3 minutes of useful power before the cylinder head temperatures climbed past the red line and the bearings seized. 3 minutes sounds like time. At 200 feet over hostile territory with the engine unwinding, it amounts to nothing. He put it down. The details of the crash landing itself don't survive in any official record with enough specificity to reconstruct the exact field or the exact date. Carr told the story multiple times over the decades after the war, and the versions agree on the essentials while diverging on minor points: which field, which day, whether he belly landed or set it down gear up in a pasture. Sources conflict on the timeline by as much as 48 hours. The consistent core: he walked away from the airplane. He destroyed what he could of the instrument panel and the gun sight, and then he started moving west. November in Central Europe meant short days and long freezing nights. Carr had his flight suit, his leather A2 jacket, his boots. No survival kit worth mentioning. No sidearm. Some Mustang pilots carried .45s, others didn't bother, and the records don't specify what Carr had or didn't have when he climbed out of the wreck. No food, no map, or at least none useful enough to navigate by on foot through terrain he'd only ever seen from 15,000 feet at 300 knots. He walked for days. The hunger hit first, then the cold settled into his joints and stayed there. Carr avoided roads during daylight, moved through tree lines and hedgerows, slept in ditches and haystacks when he could find them. Germany in the winter of '44 still functioned as a police state with teeth: Wehrmacht patrols, Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth units, and ordinary civilians who understood that harboring an enemy airman carried a death sentence. An American in a leather flight jacket walking through the countryside didn't blend in. Every farmhouse posed a choice: approach and risk capture, or keep moving and risk freezing. He kept moving. The physical deterioration accelerated faster than he expected. Dehydration compounded the cold. His hands cramped, his feet blistered inside boots designed for rudder pedals, not cross-country marches through frozen mud. By the second or third day, Carr's own accounts blur here, and honestly a man in that condition loses track. He'd eaten nothing but raw turnips pulled from a harvested field, the kind of food that fills the stomach without delivering much actual energy. His body burned through its reserves. The shivering became constant, a full-body tremor that wouldn't stop even when he found shelter from the wind. At some point during those days on the ground, the calculus shifted in his head. Carr reached a conclusion that thousands of downed Allied airmen reached before him. Surrender beat dying in a ditch. German POW camps held terrible conditions, but they held conditions: food and shelter. A chance of surviving until the war ended, which by late '44, everyone on both sides knew couldn't last much longer. The rational move, the move that every survival briefing and every escape and evasion lecture endorsed as the fallback option, pointed toward finding the nearest German military unit and putting his hands up. So he looked for Germans, and he found them in the form of a Luftwaffe airfield. The base sat at the edge of a tree line, visible from a ridge where Carr had stopped to rest. He could see the layout: dispersal areas, a runway, revetments with aircraft parked under camouflage netting. Ground personnel moved between buildings. The whole installation hummed with the routine activity of a functioning military airfield in a country that still, despite everything the Allied air forces had thrown at it, kept fighters operational and fueled. Carr started walking toward it with the intention of giving himself up. Then he stopped. He looked at those airplanes sitting in their revetments, Focke-Wulf 190s, squat and radial-nosed, their cowlings facing into the wind like sleeping animals. An idea took shape that had no business forming in the mind of a starving, half-frozen 20-year-old lieutenant from Ponca City, Oklahoma. He didn't surrender. Carr waited until dark. He crouched in the tree line through the last hours of daylight, watching the ground crews cycle through their routines, refueling, arming, running up engines for maintenance checks. He memorized the pattern. Who walked where? When the sentries changed? Which revetments held aircraft that looked flyable versus stripped-down hulks cannibalized for parts? The cold gnawed at him, but the cold had become background noise by now, just another input his body processed while his mind worked the problem. The version Carr told after the war, the version that entered aviation folklore and stayed there for decades, goes like this. Before dawn, he moved from the tree line to the nearest revetment. A Focke-Wulf 190 sat fueled and armed, its cowling still warm from a recent engine run. German mechanics had prepped it for an early morning sortie, then gone to get coffee or breakfast or whatever Luftwaffe ground crews did at dark 30 on a freezing November morning. Carr climbed onto the wing root. The metal felt slick with frost under his cracked fingers. He swung a leg over the cockpit rail and lowered himself into the seat, the same seat that Section 3 described running hot from radial engine heat, except now, in the pre-dawn cold, the aluminum felt like sitting on a block of ice. The harness buckles bit through his flight suit. The instrument panel stared back at him in German, every gauge labeled in a language he couldn't read, every switch position reversed from what his muscle memory expected. The stick fell naturally to hand. That part translated. A control column works the same in any language. Pull back, the nose rises. Push forward, it drops. Ailerons left, ailerons right. The fundamentals of flight don't care about nationality. He found the starter. The BMW 801 caught on the first try, 14 cylinders barking to life in a sequence that shattered the pre-dawn quiet like a grenade going off in a library. The propeller spun up, blasting frost off the revetment walls. Carr didn't wait for the oil temperature to climb. He didn't wait for anything. He released the brakes, fed in throttle, and the 190 lurched forward onto the taxiway with a ground-handling directness that nearly put him into a drainage ditch before he found the rudder authority. The runway stretched ahead. Behind him, in the story as Carr told it, German personnel spilled out of buildings, shouting, pointing, trying to process the sight of one of their own fighters taxiing toward takeoff with no scheduled sortie on the board. Nobody shot. That detail matters, whether from sheer disbelief or the institutional paralysis that grips any military organization when something happens that falls completely outside the expected threat matrix. Nobody put a bullet into the airplane or its pilot. Carr firewalled the throttle. The 190 accelerated down the runway with the brutal authority of 1,300 horsepower, pulling an airframe designed to leave the ground in under 400 meters. The tail came up. The rumble of the landing gear on packed earth smoothed into the clean vibration of flight. Carr pulled back on the stick and climbed into a gray European sky, pointed the nose west, and flew the stolen Focke-Wulf back to Allied lines. He landed at a forward American airstrip. Friendly anti-aircraft gunners nearly killed him on the way in. An FW-190, with Luftwaffe markings approaching an American field, triggered exactly the response you'd expect. Carr put the gear down, rocked the wings, and somehow communicated that the madman in the German fighter belonged to the 354th. He set it down, climbed out, and reportedly told his commanding officer he wanted credit for the kill. "I want my airplane back," the CO said, or words to that effect. Carr supposedly replied, "Then give me another one." The CO pointed out that he'd lost a P-38 worth over $100,000. Carr had returned with a Focke-Wulf worth nothing to the American supply chain. Great story. One of the best of the entire war, frankly. Carr told it with conviction and charm for 50 years after VE Day, and audiences loved it every time. The problem started when researchers tried to verify it. Aviation Geek Club's investigation pulled the thread that unraveled the tapestry. The photographic evidence they assembled told a different story than the one Carr narrated. Not a story of fraud, necessarily, but a story considerably less cinematic than the legend. The timeline buckled under scrutiny. The aircraft in the photographs raised questions that Carr's account couldn't answer. May 1945. The shooting had stopped. Germany lay in pieces, carved into occupation zones, its airfields littered with abandoned equipment that nobody guarded anymore. And Bruce Carr, still 20 years old, still flying with the 354th, found himself stationed in southern Germany with time on his hands and an itch that peacetime couldn't scratch. The photographs tell it. Forget Carr's words and the folklore. The photographs. Aviation researchers cross-referenced the images of Carr's captured Focke-Wulf against unit records, location data stamped on the prints, and the physical condition of the airfield visible in the background. The airplane didn't come from a frozen November revetment in Czechoslovakia. It came from a former Luftwaffe facility near Linz, Austria, sometime after VE Day, during the chaotic weeks when American units occupied territory still cluttered with intact German hardware. The declassified unit history of the 354th places Carr in exactly that area during exactly that window. No combat, no flak, no starving trek through enemy territory. Occupation duty. So what did he actually do? Look at the sequence, because it still takes nerve even without the Hollywood framing. Carr hitched a ride, Jeep most likely, though one account says he bummed a seat on a liaison aircraft, to an airfield where Focke-Wulf 190s sat in rows, abandoned by Luftwaffe personnel who had either surrendered or melted into the civilian population. The base had no functioning German military presence. American or Allied troops controlled the area. Carr walked the flight line, picked an airframe that looked complete, and decided he wanted to fly it home, not escape in it, not steal it under fire, fly it home as a trophy, the way dozens of American pilots across the ETO grabbed souvenir aircraft from captured fields in those first weeks after surrender. The British did similar things. RAF pilots ferried, captured Messerschmitt 262s and Heinkel 162s back to England for evaluation, though their efforts carried official sanction and test pilot oversight. Carr's effort carried neither. He had a problem, though. Several problems. First, he couldn't read the instrument panel. That part of the legend holds true. German placards, German units on the gauges, German labeling on every switch and circuit breaker. The Kommandogerät automated most engine management, which actually simplified the startup procedure compared to an American fighter, where the pilot manually controlled mixture, prop pitch, and throttle independently. But simplified didn't mean intuitive. Carr had never sat in a 190's cockpit during any formal familiarization. He figured it out by logic, by the physical layout of controls that shared a common aeronautical grammar across nations. Throttle on the left, stick in the center, rudder pedals on the floor, gear lever and flap switch roughly where you'd expect them. Second problem, the landing gear. The 190 used a retraction system operated by a switch on the left console, and the gear indicator lights required electrical power from a generator that only spun at engine RPM. Carr either didn't locate the gear handle or didn't trust the system enough to cycle it. The records on this point stay frustratingly thin. What the photographs confirm beyond argument is the result. He belly-landed the Focke-Wulf at the 354th's home field, grinding the underside across the strip and bending the propeller blades back into the characteristic curl of a prop strike. The damage pattern in the photos matches a gear-up landing at moderate speed, not a crash, a controlled slide. Third problem, and this one could have killed him, flying a Luftwaffe-marked fighter through airspace patrolled by trigger-happy American units required an escort. Carr arranged for P-51s from his own group to fly formation with him, bracketing the 190 so that any ground observer or airborne patrol could see the German aircraft traveled under friendly supervision. Smart, the kind of practical thinking that separates a reckless pilot from a calculated one. He pulled it off. Belly landed, walked away, posed for photographs next to the crumpled Focke-Wulf with the same grin he carried through 15 aerial victories and God knows how many strafing runs. The airplane sat in the mud with its gear folded underneath it and its prop chewed up. A war trophy that cost the American taxpayer nothing and provided Carr with a story he'd spend the next half-century improving. That's the gap. Between what happened and what Carr said happened, 50 years of retelling added a November blizzard, a starving escape, a pre-dawn theft under the noses of armed Germans, and a solo flight through hostile airspace with no escort. The real version required audacity. The legend required a movie script. Langley Field, Virginia, 1946. A former Luftwaffe Oberstleutnant sat across a table from an American intelligence officer working through a questionnaire about late-war airfield security. The Germans' answers filled 12 pages of single-spaced typescript: fuel shortages, personnel shortages, the collapse of the Luftwaffe's ground defense network in the final months. One response stands out. Asked whether enemy infiltration of operational airfields posed a significant threat in late '44, the officer wrote that by November, his unit couldn't post adequate sentries because every able-bodied man had been reassigned to either flying duties or flak batteries. "We guarded the fuel," he wrote, "not the airplanes." The airplanes by that point outnumbered the pilots qualified to fly them. Bruce Carr's legend survived for 50 years without serious challenge because of conditions exactly like that. The story worked because the conditions it described, a Luftwaffe airfield undermanned, overstocked with idle fighters, vulnerable to a single determined intruder, matched what actually existed across Germany by the winter of '44. American air superiority hadn't just beaten the Luftwaffe in the sky, it had hollowed out the infrastructure on the ground. Fuel production collapsed after the 8th Air Force's systematic campaign against synthetic oil plants starting in May of that year. Pilot training programs compressed from months into weeks, then days. Airfields that once housed fully staffed Jagdgeschwader now operated as skeleton facilities, where ground crews outnumbered flyable aircraft and flyable aircraft outnumbered qualified pilots. A starving American lieutenant walking onto one of these bases and stealing a fighter sounded outrageous, but only slightly more outrageous than the documented reality of what those bases had become. The Japanese experienced the same terminal decay, though the mechanism differed. By late '44, Imperial Japanese Navy airfields on the home islands stockpiled aircraft for kamikaze operations with ground crews who understood that those planes would fly exactly once. Security focused on preventing sabotage by forced laborers, not on guarding against individual infiltrators. But that's another story. Carr's myth persisted because it sat at the intersection of two truths. First, American fighter pilots in the ETO operated with a swagger that came from institutional dominance, not personal delusion. The 354th Fighter Group flew over 16,000 sorties between D-Day and VE Day. They destroyed 401 enemy aircraft. The group lost pilots. Of course it lost pilots, but the replacement pipeline never dried up. The spare parts never stopped arriving. The fuel trucks always had fuel, and the mechanics kept every flyable airframe in rotation. A pilot from that unit believing he could steal an enemy fighter and fly it home didn't represent madness. It represented the logical extension of an air force that had spent 2 years proving it could do anything it wanted over European airspace. Second truth, the Luftwaffe's own officers confirmed the collapse. FMS reports filed by German commanders after the war describe airfields where security amounted to a single elderly Feldwebel with a bicycle and a flashlight. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland's post-war interrogations detail the fuel crisis in terms that make Carr's legend sound conservative. Galland described units that received factory-fresh Messerschmitt 262s and parked them under trees because they had no jet fuel to put in them. 1,200 jet fighters built. A fraction flew combat missions. The rest sat in the open, unguarded, waiting for American ground troops to roll over them. Against that backdrop, a 20-year-old from Oklahoma walking onto a Luftwaffe field and flying away in a 190 barely registers as implausible. The real question flips, not, could he have done it? But, why didn't more pilots try? Some did. The records mention at least 3 other instances of American pilots attempting to fly captured German aircraft back to friendly lines during the final 6 months of the war. One P-47 pilot from the 56th Fighter Group reportedly started the engine of a Messerschmitt 109 at a captured field near Aachen, but couldn't figure out the fuel selector and shut it down. That detail lives in a unit history footnote and goes nowhere. Interesting, irrelevant to Carr's specific case, but it shows the impulse existed across the force. Carr didn't need to steal a fighter under fire to prove something about American air power. He proved it by existing in a system so dominant that stealing enemy aircraft became a hobby. The Luftwaffe couldn't stop the 8th Air Force from burning down their oil plants or the 9th from shredding their rail network. After the surrender, they couldn't even stop a kid from Oklahoma from taking one of their airplanes home as a souvenir. Two Focke-Wulf 190s bracket the entire arc of the Luftwaffe's war in the West. The first one landed at RAF Pembrey on the 23rd of June, 1942, because Armin Faber got confused after a dogfight and flew north instead of south. That single aircraft, one A3 variant with paint scratches and a full ammunition load, forced the RAF to redesign its frontline fighter, accelerated the Spitfire 9 program, and gave Allied intelligence the Rosetta Stone for defeating a machine they'd spent 6 months failing to match. The Luftwaffe lost it through a navigation error, one pilot's mistake. The organization behind him remained lethal, professional, deep in resources, and deeper in confidence. Extracting a 190 from German hands in mid-42 required either extraordinary luck or an act of God. Faber delivered both. The second one landed, belly first, gear up, prop bent, at an American airstrip in Austria in May of 1945 because Bruce Carr felt like it. No confusion, no miracle. A 20-year-old from Ponca City drove to an unguarded airfield, picked a fighter off the shelf like a man browsing a hardware store, and flew it home with a Mustang escort. The Luftwaffe lost it because the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a functioning military institution. 3 years separated those two airplanes. In that window, American industrial capacity, American strategic bombing, American fighter doctrine, and American logistical depth broke the most technically sophisticated air force in Europe so completely that its airfields became open-air museums for souvenir hunters. Gallen's post-war testimony, recorded at Kaufbeuren during his USSBS interrogation, put the timeline on it. He dated the Luftwaffe's terminal decline to the spring of '44, when 8th Air Force escort fighters began flying ahead of the bomber stream to hunt German interceptors on the climb. Before that, Gallen told his interrogators, we fought the bombers. After that, we fought for survival. 14 months from survival to surrender. The fuel campaign accelerated the collapse, but the killing blow fell in the air, delivered by P-51s and P-47s flying out of English bases that never ran short of aviation gasoline or replacement pilots. The numbers do the talking. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe fielded roughly 2,000 day fighters on all fronts. By January 45, operational strength on the Western Front had dropped below 300. Not because Germany stopped building airplanes. Speer's dispersed production network actually increased fighter output through the fall of '44, pushing over 3,000 airframes per month off the assembly lines. The airplanes existed, the pilots to fly them, the fuel to fill them, the ground crews to maintain them, the instructors to train the next cohort. Those had evaporated under the constant pressure of an American air campaign that treated the Luftwaffe not as an opponent to outfight, but as a system to dismantle. Oil plant by oil plant, training base by training base, until the whole structure folded inward. Faber's 190 terrified the Allies because it represented an enemy at full strength, fast, well-armed, flown by pilots with years of combat experience, supported by an industrial base running at capacity. Carr's 190 sat in a row of identical abandoned fighters on a field where the last German mechanic had walked away weeks earlier. Same airplane. Same 14-cylinder radial. Same wide-track landing gear. Same armored ring around the engine. Same electrically driven commandogerät managing the fuel-air mixture. Everything identical except the organization behind it, which had gone from apex predator to roadkill in 36 months. I think that's the real story here. Not whether Carr stole the airplane under fire or picked it up during occupation duty, though the difference matters for the historical record, and researchers did the right thing pulling the thread. The real story sits in the distance between Faber's 190 and Carr's. In '42, the Allies needed a miracle to get their hands on one. In 45, any American with a jeep and some nerve could grab one off an unguarded flight line. The Luftwaffe built a magnificent fighter. American air power made it irrelevant. Carr flew P-51s for another 2 weeks after the belly landing, running routine patrols over Austrian airspace where nothing flew except Allied transports and the occasional lost civilian Storch. His squadron log for the 3rd week of May 1945 lists 4 sorties under his name: takeoff times, fuel loads, route assignments. The entry after his Focke-Wulf joyride reads, "Local patrol, duration 1 hour 40 minutes, nothing to report." Carr signed the form and went to lunch.